This story was explained to me as being a story about the first man to have a Mistabeo. Now, Mistabeo, it means literally big man. Mista, big, abeo, man. But it's not a giant, okay? It's what he can do. This is a spiritual big man. And he didn't have one Mistabeo. He actually had 5 of them. I don't know why. And there are other stories, old myths like this one, where the man has a Mistabeo, and it seems like that one might have been chronologically prior. When you get a contradiction like that in myths, the rule of thumb is just don't worry about it. That's just the way myths are, okay? They don't help each other out in that way, although they do help you to understand them, understand each other in a way. Anyway, this man, Cowa was his name, and it's a pretty well-known story. A predecessor of mine who was at Waskaganish in the 1930s, Regina Flannery from Catholic University, did a little paper on myths, and she talked about having half a dozen versions that she had collected. Chewa, Chowa, different pronunciations, but same story basically. And so it's one that John told me after a few summers of my going there. So it would have been 65, 6, 7, somewhere in there, I guess. So Chowa was had a wife and a young child, and maybe more than one child. We're not sure about that. And they started the fall hunt, and his luck was very poor. And so he decided that he would conjure to get one of his Mistabeos to help him out. And so this Mistabeo came to Cowa and he said, well, you're going to have more trouble in hunting. You're going to wind up being out of food altogether. And then you're going to kill a beaver, which of course is very rich food, and so it's good news. But when you kill this beaver, you can't feed any of it to your wife or your kids. Strange, right? So Cowa listened to this, and then they're back to their hunting and not finding anything, running out of food, starving, and then he kills the beaver. And so he says to his wife, told her what the Mistabeo had said, and what do you think I ought to do? And his wife thought it over and she said, well, I guess the kids are going to be crying in the morning if they don't have anything to eat. Which is a very discreet, Cree, respectful way of saying, let's share it out. Person has to feed his children, so he did. Well, then he got into real trouble with hunting. He couldn't find anything. Finally, by this time there was snow on the ground, and they were traveling with toboggan. Cowa with snowshoes would break trail, and then his wife would come along pulling the toboggan where he had tamped the snow down. And there was at least one child on the toboggan. She was pulling along. They continued that way as long as he could. Could find no tracks. Things were pretty desperate. Finally, Cowa's wife caught up to him and found that he had fallen and that he was on his knees. Now, this is a very bad sign. You know, when a man is so weak that he can't stand up, his chances are really bad. So his wife made space for him on the toboggan and helped him to the toboggan, covered him over with whatever furs they had, along with the kids there. And she started out, breaking trail herself and pulling the toboggan, hoping to find some tracks. They went along for some time. I couldn't say just how long, but maybe a few hours anyway. And Cowa realized that his wife had stopped. And then he could hear her crying. And Cowa said, "Are you crying because the way is hard?" And she said, "No, I'm crying because I have found tracks of caribou and you're not strong enough to kill them." So Cowa said, "Help me get up." Now, his wife was nursing the baby at that time. And so Cowa suckled from his wife's breasts to get a little nourishment and took his spear and his bow and told her, set up the teepee here. He would try to get back to them with something to eat. So he started along the tracks of the caribou, wondering if he would last long enough to get to them. And as he was going along, he saw the tracks of several men coming in and following the caribou tracks too. And he could tell from the distance from one step to the next in their tracks that these were very strong men. He figured they were his Mistabeos. So he made a decision. They're going to get to these caribou long before he will, if he would get there at all. So instead he followed their tracks back. And he came to a large conjuring tent, which is a barrel-shaped, not a teepee, a barrel-shaped tent. And he went inside. And as his eyes adjusted to the darkness, he could see that by the fire in the center, there was the form of a man covered with ashes from the fire. And at the back of the tent, there was this old man, the head Mistabeo. So Cowa took this in, and then the old Mistabeo said, "That one that's by the fire hasn't moved or eaten since you killed that beaver and fed it to your kids." So Cowa sat down by the doorway, and shortly the others came back with some caribou meat. And then a woman came into the tent to stoke up the fire, and she brought with her a porcupine and a wooden plate. It's what they made plates of, carved plate, and a piece of caribou hide. And she was wearing an iron dress and iron gloves, and she plucked the quills off the porcupine and then roasted it. And she put it on the plate and covered it with a caribou hide and gave it to the head Mistabeo. He uncovered it. He started eating. He ate the entire thing. Cowa thought to himself, I guess this is the only one that's going to eat. But the man, Mistabeo, put bones on a plate, covered it over with a caribou skin, and passed it to the one to his right. And the man uncovered it, and it was whole again. All the meat was back. And so it started around the tent. Each time the man eating everything, leaving nothing, and then covering it, and around it came. So I thought, it is time for me to act. Now, the only thing he had of any value was a little bit of tobacco. And he got up and he walked over to the head Mistabeo and handed him his tobacco. The head Mistabeo said, "Cowa has given me some tobacco." And the one covered in ashes sat up, stood up and said, "Is that true?" And went over and looked. Then the porcupine finally came around at last to Cowa. Thought maybe it won't work for me, but when he uncovered it, there it was. So Cowa ate, first time in a while, and then the head Mistabeo said, "At this same time, your wife has killed a few ptarmigan, and so they are surviving. If you want to, you may go and get them and bring them to the tent. But these men here don't like to have a woman look at them. So if she comes in, she has to just look down and not look around." So that's what Cowa did. And he found that his wife and kids were okay and brought them to the tent. And when she came in, she just sat close to the door and didn't look up. Now, these Mistabeos had a fire that did not require more wood. It just kept on burning. Okay? That's the Mistabeo's fire. So, it was night. People started to prepare to sleep. Finally, it seemed like everybody was asleep except Cowa's wife. She thought, maybe if I just quickly look around now, they won't know. So she raised her head and she looked around, and all she saw was men. So she went to sleep. Early in the morning, Cowa and his wife awoke. It was very cold. The tent coverings were gone, the fire was gone, the Mistabeos were gone. So Cowa's wife told him the truth, what had happened. She said she was very sorry, and she guessed they would have to set out and try to make things right with them. And Cowa said, "No, they're too much trouble. We're just going to have to see if we can survive without them." End of story. Now, compare this to the Adam and Eve story, okay? Eve, as Cowa's wife, does something that she's prohibited from doing. What happens? Oh, the Lord's very angry. They're banished forever from Eden to live by the sweat of their brows, so on, so on, so on. Not Cowa. Cowa made a decision back when he had that first porcupine. Family first. Cowa came to the same decision when the Mistabeos left in anger. They're asking too much. It's family first. So rather than blame his wife and put that on wives for all time, Cowa says, no, we'll manage as best we can by ourselves. I really like that. And that's the end of that story. Yeah.